Our webinar today is unique in that instead of profiling two papers, we decided to focus on one article that we think deals with an important topic for marketers around the world, and that is generating insight from the abundance of marketing text to drive marketing and other strategic decisions. Think about it. How does Siri get better at answering customer queries and predicting their needs? It applies artificial intelligence and machine learning to voice transcripts. This process that we know as automated text analysis pervades marketplace interactions. Online reviews, customer service calls, press releases, news articles, marketing communications, and other interactions create a wealth of text data that companies can analyze to optimize services and develop new products. By some estimates, 80 to 90% of all business data is unstructured, with most of that being text. This text has the potential to provide critical insights about its producers, including individuals' identities, their relationships, and their goals. It can also be aggregated to create insights about organizations and social institutions and how attitudes vary over cultural context, demographics, groups, and time. But how can marketers use such data? A new article in the Journal of Marketing provides an overview of automated text analysis and describes how it can be harnessed to generate marketing insights. 3 distinguished authors from that article are here with us today to share their perspectives on using text for marketing insight. Jonah Berger is Associate Professor of Marketing at the Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania. Professor Berger is an expert on word of mouth, viral marketing, social influence, and how products, ideas, and behaviors catch on, and is the best-selling author of Contagious, Why Things Catch On, and Invisible Influence, the hidden forces that shape behavior. Ashlee Humphreys is the Associate Professor of Integrated Marketing Communications at the Medill School of Journalism, Northwestern University. Trained as a sociologist, Professor Humphreys is the author of the book Social Media, Enduring Principles. Oded Netzer is Professor of Business, Columbia Business School at Columbia University. Professor Netzer's expertise centers on developing quantitative methods that leverage data to gain a deeper understanding of customer behavior and guide firm decisions. He focuses primarily on building statistical and econometric models to measure customer preferences and leveraging text mining techniques for business applications. Welcome, Jonah, Ashlee, and Oded. It's wonderful to have you with us here today.
Thanks, Chris. I think we're very excited to chat with the audience and to talk about something I think we're all wrestling with, and we're trying to figure out the most effective way to deal with it. And so, I don't have to tell this audience that there's a huge amount of textual data out there, whether we think about online reviews, social media posts, text, we think about customer service calls, open-ended survey questions that we might put out there, whether we think about firm annual reports, the text created by our ads, even newspaper articles, movie scripts, and song lyrics. All of this language or textual data either is text itself or is language from a customer service call that can be turned into text. One question is, well, what can we do with all this data? We're all sitting on this huge wealth of data, but how can we turn it into insight? And so that's really what we're going to talk about today, how we can take all this data that's out there and extract insight from it. And so how can we turn essentially this unstructured data into structured data that we can extract insight from? Let me just see here if I can click to the next slide. Why is this not working? There we go. Good, great. 80 to 90% or 95% of all business data is unstructured, and most unstructured data is text. And so what we're really interested in today is what's the value of that unstructured data? How can we turn that unstructured data into insight? I'm not seeming to able to have advanced properties on this. If somebody else can.
If you click on the right-hand side, it says previous and next. If you click next there, or you just use your next arrow, that should move you forward. If not, one of us can help. One of the other. There we go. Okay.
I didn't click that.
While Jonah's figuring it I just wanted to remind everybody that you can ask questions. Actually, there's two tabs over on the left-hand side. One says Studio Chat, and the other says Questions and Answers. So you would like to, if you would like to ask a question, which you can do at any point during the talk, go ahead and type your questions into the tab that's labeled Questions and Answers. And then when we get to about the 30 to 40-minute mark, then we'll go to Q&A, and I can retrieve your questions and share those with the presenters.
Okay, I'm still not able to control them, it seems like, so I'll just hit mention next slide. Thanks, Ashlee, I appreciate it. So one thing we'll talk about today is the power of textual data to unite the tribes of marketing. And so when we think about marketing either within an organization or sort of academic approaches to marketing, we kind of think about different branches or different tribes, groups that often speak very frequently within their own group, speak frequently to themselves, but don't talk as much to other groups. So think about folks really within an organization that might have a consumer behavior background. Think about designing experiments or often surveys to extract insight. Think about the more quantitative folks in an organization, folks that have econometric or statistical toolkits that are really interested in analyzing existing data for insight. Think about the strategy folks that are interested in rich data for both on firms and consumers. And think about the more qualitative or anthropological type of individuals, more of a kind of consumer culture background. They really think about analyzing the richness of often data to provide insight. These groups are fantastic. Each of them has a lot of insight to be provided, but they often don't talk to one another. One reason why we're so excited about textual data is it really both unites and requires the integration of these different skill sets. I think about textual data, for example, often highly unstructured, provides lots of new predictors, but also provides methodological challenges for folks that have more of a quant background. For consumer behavior researchers, it allows us to study many things at once, which is great, but if we can't quantify those things, we can't extract the behavioral insight we're interested in. Think about the strategy folks that are interested in providing insight into firms and as well as consumer behavior. We need to extract those insights as data provides a toolkit, and think about qualitative or more consumer culture types of researchers or individuals within firms that have long been interested in these types of data but have not necessarily quantified them before. And so really analyzing textual data and really extracting insight from the rich textual data that's out there requires putting together these different toolkits. It really requires some of the tools are highly quantitative in nature, and so requires the insight that toolkit has. It requires interpreting data, something that consumer culture or CCT folks are very good at. It requires thinking about underlying methodological questions, but also behavioral drivers that consumer behavior researchers might be more familiar with, and thinks about how these issues relate to the firm and the strategy that the firm might engage in. And so all of these different tribes can and need to come together in some sense to make these tools work. So if we go to the next slide, one thing we've thought a lot about is how there are two roles as we think about text or language being out there. The role of the textual or language producer and the role of the textual or language consumer. And so if we look at the next slide, for example, we think about beyond social media, there's lots of types of consumers listed on the left, and lots of types of producers listed up top. So to give you an example of what we mean here, consumers produce online reviews that are also consumed by other consumers. So someone might write an online review. I went and saw a movie. I have an opinion on it. I write an online review that another consumer might read. I might share offline word of mouth. I might talk about a product or service that I've used. I, as an individual consumer, am producing that text, but another consumer is the one consuming that text. When you call a call center, for example, the consumer is still producing the text, but the firm might be consuming that text. Or we think about another box where a firm produces an ad. That is a firm producing the content, but the consumer is the one consuming that content. And so we can think about lots of different roles as text producers and as text consumers. And this 3x3 just gives some examples of different producers on the left and consumers up top. We think about different types of textual data that's out there, certainly going much beyond social media, but giving us some sense of the different types of text that we can look at. I think many of us are probably familiar looking at that top left bucket, that consumer to consumer bucket. Many of us have probably used things like social listening to pay attention to social media. We may have even mined online databases or customer reviews as a way to gain insight. Some of us might have thought about the consumer to firm link using call center data or chats as an opportunity, but I think most of us have not necessarily paid attention to these other squares. Not all the squares are important for all of the roles and organizations that we're in, but at least being aware of those different possibilities may allow us to gain deeper insight. Even thinking where firms speak to other firms, for example. Lots of researchers in the finance and accounting space have looked at financial reports or annual reports as a way to mine what a given firm is saying as a way to gain insight into their future stock performance. And so lots of data is both produced and consumed. And so if we go to the next slide, we can think about two ways that we often think about using textual data. The first is that language reflects, and the second is that language affects or impacts the people that listen to it. Another way to say is language reflects something about the producers that create that language or that text, and the second is that language affects or impacts the consumers or the people that are listening to that language being used. I imagine most of us out there are probably more familiar with the second bucket. I'm going to talk a little bit about the first, and then we'll transition to the second bucket, thinking about how they're different. So in terms of this first bucket, the idea here is really that language is almost like a fingerprint. Many researchers, for example, some of the early uses of textual analysis was thinking about things like, can we figure out if this play that we're not sure who authored it was authored by Shakespeare? Right? Just like a person has a fingerprint, language often acts as a fingerprint. It gives us a sense of who that person is. It can allow us to figure out, for example, did Shakespeare create this play or did someone else create it? And so in a sense, then, language reflects, right? It provides insight into the individuals, organizations, and context that generate that language. It doesn't just tell us something about the person, but it suggests something about the broader context in which that language was created. And so going to the next slide, for example, imagine someone posts online, I love the new Joker movie. They saw the movie a couple weeks ago, and they post that they like that movie. And so that says not only impacts other people, which we'll talk about in a second, impacts whether other people might see it, but it reflects things about them. It tells us something about their personality, right? The fact that they use an exclamation point, for example, might give us some insight into the type of personality they have. Lots of research looks at how language, as well as paralanguage, signals things about the producers of that language. And it also obviously reflects their feeling or their attitude towards an attitude object. It not only tells us about them, it tells us something about how they feel about something else. It reflects something about who they are and provides insight into them and their attitude towards something else. And so there are lots of ways that we can think about language reflecting. Oded, for example, has done some nice research looking at how an aggregate, this can be used for market research. So think about using discussion boards, online discussion boards. Obviously, each individual is telling us something about their own personal opinion, but taking that into aggregate, putting it all together, gives us some insight not just into their individual opinion, but the set of opinions across the board. We can look, for example, about the coincidence of different brands. So we look at Subaru, let's take, as a car brand, for example. When someone posts about Subaru, what other brands do they tend to mention in that post as well? Compare that with Lexus, for example. What other brands do people tend to mention when they talk about Lexus? Or what other attributes do they tend to talk about? And we can use things like multidimensional scaling to, in a sense, give us a map of that brand space. Right? Just like we might use survey data to get a sense of how people perceive different brands, and then use multidimensional scaling to say, here's some different clusters or groups of brands that are similar on whatever dimension we might care about. We don't have to ask those questions. We can actually use existing data to provide insight into some of those questions. Using data that's already out there ready, we can say, well, how does consumers' language reflect things about the market position of different brands? So that's one example. Moving to the next slide, I'll just give an example of some work we've done recently. We can also think about language as reflecting culture over time. So it not just says something about an individual that created a certain post or potentially a brand. It can also say something about culture at large. So this picture, for example, we looked at about 250,000 songs over 50 to 60 years to look at misogyny in music. Lots of people have said, hey, is music misogynist? Does it talk about women in particular ways? And so one thing we did in this analysis is use language, look at competence-related words, and use a tool called word embeddings to allow us to say, okay, over time, how are women and men discussed? And does their relationship to words that relate to competence, does that change over time? And so we can see something about the culture at large as well. Many brands are interested in trend forecasting. What's going to be popular next? What are going to be the hits next year? What are going to be the fashion or the ideas or the terms that people care a lot about? And so by looking at some of this data over time, we can forecast what it's like to be in the future, for example. This data suggests, look, things have gotten better. It's not as biased. Music is not as biased towards men as it used to be. But at least in the past few years, it's turned around, gotten a little bit worse, and it certainly isn't even. And so far we've talked about how language reflects or says something about the producer, the people that created it, but language also obviously impacts. It shapes the attitudes and behaviors of the audience who consumes it. Right? Not just the producer's language, but the audience who consumes that language. And so, colleagues of ours, for example, have done some very nice research on customer service calls. Just going to the next slide, for example, looking at the language and how the language a customer agent uses shapes whether the consumer is satisfied at the end of that call, for example. Obviously, if an airline loses your bags, you want your money back in addition to getting your bags, maybe money back on a flight. But could the words that customer service agent uses actually make you more satisfied regardless of what they give you? And so a number of authors have begun to look at the language in these calls and how the language the agent uses impacts the listeners or consumers that are calling into the firm. Some research I myself have done recently and looking at reading depth in online content. So many of us create written content, both on our website and other places. We're interested in people reading that content. Obviously, we want them to engage with the content we create. Well, what leads to longer reads? What about how articles are written makes people more or less likely to read them? And so just animating the slide, briefly just going through the different buckets. Looks like the animation got lost there, no problem. So to give you some sense, what we find is that positive emotion, talking more positively, leads to longer reads. But it's not just that negative emotions all decrease reading, while sadness decreases reading, anger and anxiety actually increase reading, and other things that increase reading ease, things like familiarity and concreteness, increase the likelihood that people continue reading, but things like flesh and key reading level or parse tree height decrease the likelihood that people continue reading. And so the way we write that online content can shape how long people are likely to read it. And then the next couple slides will show a few more examples of this. So this, for example, is the original Star Wars movie. What we've done is we've taken the script, we've chunked the scripts into a variety of different blocks, 250-word blocks. We've taken the sentiment of each of those chunks, and we've plotted it over time. And so what you can see is that it increases in positivity, then decreases all the way down, goes back up again, down, up, and up, and up. What we found is that can help explain sales by understanding the trajectory of emotion over time within the text of the movie. It gives us some insight into how the consumers of that movie are going to feel, whether they're going to like the movie and whether it might sell more tickets. And similarly, on the next slide, we've done something related in music. We've used a technique that I think Ashlee and Oded will talk about in a couple of minutes called topic modeling to extract the key topics or themes from songs. So what this picture, for example, shows is that country music sings a lot about things like girls and cars. Christian music sings a lot about a category we call spiritual, and hip-hop or rap talks a little bit more about street cred. We can extract the underlying topics or themes that are written about in songs, and we can then use those themes or topics to understand why some songs are more popular. Our research, for example, shows that songs that are more atypical, more different from their genre, end up being more successful. And so if you think about the song The Old Town Road that was very popular this summer, it was a country song, but it sang about themes that were very different than what we usually think about in the country domain. And so we can use lyrics not only to understand how an agent's language might impact a listener or a consumer, but understand how a producer of content, like a movie studio or like a music artist, how their language might impact the reception that content achieves more broadly across culture. And so just one last slide from me, and then I'll turn it over. It's an important distinction between prediction and understanding. And I think some of us may have used more machine learning or AI-based approaches. And what we're often very interested there is prediction. We don't actually care why something happened. We just care about getting a high degree of prediction. We want to know which of our different consumers, for example, might default on a loan. We might want to know which of our consumers might most benefit from a marketing ad or promotional activity being sent to them. We don't know why it necessarily works, but we can mine all the data that we have insight into to gain prediction. And some people talk about text mining, and I think what they often mean when they say that is thinking about prediction, often prediction, but But another way to think about using textual data is understanding. And there we're less interested in high degrees of prediction and more about understanding why something occurred. So we can think about the distinction between which customer is likely to be unsatisfied. We can mine textual data to understand why that might happen, or we can predict which customer is most likely to be unsatisfied. I think prediction is really valuable when we don't care why something's happened. We just want to take an action. We want to know who's most likely to be unsatisfied so we can follow up with them. But that doesn't necessarily tell our customer reps what language to use for the subsequent calls. And in some sense, I think understanding is more like building a recipe, right? If you understand what makes a cake taste good, you can figure out what ingredients to add more or less of. And so understanding really helps us figure out how to change our language, how to change what text appears in songs, how to change how we write online articles, not just to predict whether someone will continue reading or be satisfied at the end of the call, but really to understand what is happening and how we might change it. And so that's it for me, and I'll now turn over to talk about some of the steps that we think about when we think about text mining.
Thank you, Jonah. And, you know, being the nerd in the team, I'll talk about the more nerdy stuff around text mining, and specifically how do we go about actually doing it. Let's look a little bit under the hood in whatever we can do within the scope of a webinar. What is involved in getting all of these beautiful insights that Jonah was talking about, whether it is insights that are relevant to understand, or even just extracting these what we call textual features so we can actually predict. The first step in this process of text mining is data processing, acquiring the data and cleaning the data. Sounds boring. Part of it is, yet it is the vast majority of the time invested in any a text mining project, so do not underestimate this step, neither on length nor on complexity. The next step, which is maybe the funner part, is where we go and actually analyze the data. We actually extract information from the text after we have created data that we can work with. The third step, which we won't get too much today in the webinar, but it's how do we count? How do we go and count these metrics of textual analysis? And the last one, I would say equally important to the first step, is how do we validate it? How do we know that what we actually aim to extract from the text is actually what we indeed really extracted? How do we know what are the metrics that we really extracted? And if we aim to extract, for example, a particular emotion, how do we know that this text reflects that emotion? So going to the first step, and the step of data, again, arguably, and maybe even not arguably, the most important step in this process in terms of how long it takes and how much involved in it. Some statistics say that 80% of data analytics is in data, in the data step and acquiring the data. I would say in text it's even bigger than that. Some people say 85% of data science is getting the data, maybe 10% innovation, 5% modeling. Truly an important and often pretty long step. What this step involves is first acquiring the data, and there are a few ways of acquiring the data. Either you just got the data, or you have in your company databases, maybe this data from the website or from a set of emails that were sent, and so on and so forth. Or sometimes we actually scrape the web. We're looking for the information out there on the web. The next step is we are breaking actually the text into units, often words. There is often quite a bit of cleaning needs to be made. This cleaning often involves cleaning things like HTML tags, cleaning even things that we may not think about them in an obvious way. When I want to break, for example, words or the text into words, I need to decide what am I doing, for example, with an apostrophe. Is that going to break a word? Would the word USA will be dropped because it has 3 periods in it, or 2 periods between them? Would it become 3 words, US and A? These are the type of things you need to think of at that particular step. Almost always, in almost all analysis that we do in text, we will be removing what we call stop words, the, and so on. I say almost always, but not always, because sometimes if what you're interested in is writing style, sometimes actually it is these pronouns that actually would exactly tell you who the writer is reflecting about the writer, or even about how this writing is likely to affect other. We often need to deal with spelling mistakes, and there are several tools to do it. And the last step is a step what we call that is called stemming or lemmatization, where we go and combine words that come from the same stem, from the same verb, for example. So ran, running, run. All of these are going to be put in together to the same the same stem or the same lemma. Luckily, even though these steps are long and tedious, tools for all of them exist in at least the two most common tools these days to do textual analysis. Python and R have predefined tools in order to do it, and almost every data scientist who's graduating these days of a data science program should be well equipped to conduct these steps. Once we clean the data, let's talk about the more exciting part, which is what can we extract from it. At the most basic level, often what we want to extract from the text are the words themselves. Which word is a brand? Which word is a person? Which word is a verb, adjective? What do these words mean? And the tools that are used for it are often called entity extraction tools. It helps us understand what people are saying in terms of the specific words that they're doing. For example, if you want to monitor and listen to what word of mouth is being said about your product, entity extraction often would be quite useful. Jonah mentioned that before, at the more higher level, I'm not interested in understanding words, but I'm actually interested more in understanding the topics that people talked about. Just like Jonah was interested in the topics that people talked about in the lyrics of music, you may want to look at movies and what did people talk about in the reviews for these movies. In a paper I've done, I was looking at Airbnb hosts who were expressing the motivation to host. The topics were, what are the different motivations of people to host on Airbnb? A third type of tasks that you may want to create is understanding how positive or negative the text is. And this line of analysis is often called sentiment analysis, where we are extracting how positive or negative the overall body of text. It can be used for things like prediction models. So if I, for example, look at the sentiment of tweets about a stock ticker, can I actually figure out how well will the stock do in the future? Can I predict sales from the how positive or negative reviews are? The next task is arguably the most difficult task, and this is the task of understanding relationship between entities, which means if in the first step I just extracted entity, I said, well, people talked about the brand and talked about a particular attribute of the brand. In relationship between entities, I'm actually extracting the relationship between, for example, a product and the attributes of the product. So which attributes do people tend to talk about with respect to different products? For example, what type of side effects has been discussed about a drug, or what type of problems emerged in discussions in product reviews or in call centers. The reason why this step is a little bit more difficult than the previous steps from a more methodological point of view is that we need to truly understand the entire context of the sentence, much like humans do when they read such a text. From particularly related to the aspect of understanding who is the writer, often we are trying to understand writing style. We're trying to understand things like the personality of the writer. We may want to understand if a particular review is a deceptive review. For these, we often use different tools that are related to writing style. Just to give you a sense for what are the different tools that exist for each one of them. So, for example, for entity extraction, there are a bunch of tools related to what is called point of speech tagging, so tagging what is a verb, what is an adjective. There are a bunch of dictionaries to do it, as well as more advanced machine learning tools to understand what is a word, and sometimes even tools that belong to the family of tools called word embedding to understand the entity within the context in which it appeared in the sentence. For topic modeling, probably the most common tool out there called latent Dirichlet allocation, a publicly available tool that allows you to, you do need to know R or Python in order to do it, but given these, allows you to extract what topics people were talking about. For sentiment, the two most common approaches are either using a dictionary, so people have created a dictionary of positive and negative words, and you can use these dictionaries to rate each sentence or each body of text, whether it was positive or negative. One limitation of these dictionaries is that sometimes what is positive or negative may differ between one text and another. The word high for blood pressure is bad, for stocks is good, which makes it sometimes difficult. And for these purposes, you may want to train your own machine learning algorithm within the context of what you are studying to learn what is positive and what is negative. For relationship between entities, it's almost always at the level of machine learning that we train in order to learn the linguistics of the sentence, whether it is machine learning that is totally a black box, meaning does not teach linguistics, but rather learns from experience, or more of what we call supervised type of approaches, where we provide linguistics information into the machine learning algorithm. And finally, for writing style, probably the most commonly used tool is a tool called Look, LIWC, which allows you to capture dictionaries of different writing styles, pronouns, emotions, and so on and so forth. And with that, I want to turn it to Ashlee.
Great, thanks, Oded. So far what we've talked about, Jonah talked about issues of research design, or what do we really want to know from the text. Oded talked about how do we gain that knowledge, how do we do the analysis. But now we kind of turn to the question of how reliable are our insights from the text? How generalizable are our insights to other business contexts, to other products, and over time? And here, the main tension is really between, as Oded mentioned, kind of our fit with the data. So how well do the entities that we extract and the topics we extract fit with the data, versus how generalizable are our insights to other contexts? So, for example, if you're measuring sentiment, we can get a really good measurement of sentiment that fits our data well. Say, as Oded mentioned, if it's a medical context, we know high blood pressure is bad. But how well will that knowledge actually generalize to another context is kind of the other tension we face. And so I'm going to talk about some issues of validity and make some kind of guiding advice for navigating some of those tensions. So the first kind of validity to really think about is internal validity. So this is these questions of measurement. Are you actually measuring what you think you're measuring within the text? And it's such an important problem to address because, as Jonah said, there's so much text out there, and there's a high demand to get insights from it and to get insights very quickly, sometimes without actually looking at how the sausage is made, right? So how is our sentiment dictionary actually working? Does it actually fit with the text, and what are we counting? So these are really issues of construct validity, right? Are we actually measuring the construct of, say, sentiment, or if we're looking at male bias in songs, are we actually measuring male bias, and what does that mean in the language? And then the other issue to really think about is convergent validity. So how do we build our understanding so that what we're measuring is not just based on how we're measuring it? So for example, if we use multiple dictionaries for, say, looking at sentiment, we can ensure that there is some convergent validity in our data. So for example, if we measure online reviews with one of the sentiment dictionaries that Oded mentioned, it's really nice to know that if we repeat the process with another sentiment dictionary, that we get the same results. So both of those methods can help ensure convergent validity. For construct validity, there are a few methods that I'll just run through very, very briefly. And it really depends on how you've originally done your analysis, but here are some suggestions. So for internal validity, I think it's so important to really kind of pull some of your data and see how has data that's been flagged as, say, positive, is it actually positive? So this is called this third bullet point here, the saturation procedure. So you choose a sample of text that was coded as, say, positive, and do your own assessment. does it actually measure positivity? Or for male bias, if you're pulling some song lyrics, do those song lyrics, in your opinion, actually indicate male bias? You can also apply this to have other people do it, right? So you can, of course, have human coders check your method, as well as now we have the luxury of a lot of survey validation procedures where on Mechanical Turk or Turk Prime or lots of other kind of crowdsourcing platforms, you can have 100 people rate, my computer classified these as positive and kind of poll the audience there. So in that sense, traditional validation procedures kind of apply and their metrics sort of apply here. There's also the possibility of using holdout approaches just to make sure that your data are fitting with your model. So basically training your model on part of the data and then having a holdout sample to validate. So those are some suggestions for increasing internal validity, and they might be presented something like this. So what you have here, just at a 50,000-foot view, would be kind of your categories. And then always listing or being aware of the hit rate or the alpha or some kind of level of agreement, so you have a sense of if you are accurately measuring the construct. The other type of validity that I mentioned, the other pull in the other direction, is generalizability. So of course, you can train a topic model to capture the topics in your data. So if you have some hotel reviews, you might find 4 or 5 topics that have to do with service and amenities and the location. But how is that actually going to inform you about future projects? Are those topics going to be stable over time? These are all questions of generalizability. And so some recommendations here are to just replicate with other different data sets. In the paper that Jonah mentioned by Oded, they do this mapping for cars, and they're actually also able to generate insights for medical data from WebMD. So always keeping an eye on what else, even within your organization, this can apply to, I think can really help you generate some stable insights. And then, of course, there's predictive validity. So how well does your insights, how well do they actually predict outcomes? For example, there's this paper by Ashlee and Swidell where they look at how social TV advertising predicts discussions of advertising, but they take this a step further to look at sales. So yes, people are talking about your advertising online, on Twitter, but does that actually carry forward to predict sales? So always going that extra step to see, well, do we actually assume that what we're measuring has its predicted outcome? It is always good advice for ensuring external validity. And just a quick example of that here. So this is a study we did on word of mouth. These are product reviews from Amazon and CNET. And you can run a simple regression just to see, okay, is what I'm measuring in the text related to product rating, just star rating? And you can go a bit deeper to see, well, what features that people are talking about, what features correlate with product rating? So to sum up, we have some sort of thoughts for future movement in this area. I think the first is really to expand data sources. So Jonah showed you the table of producers and receivers of text. And we've seen a lot of research on consumer data, but there's so much more data out there that can inform marketing strategy, including offline data. We'd also like to see an expansion of actors, so beyond consumers. As I said, institutions, firms, other government entities produce text that bear on firm initiatives, and we can study some of that to help us understand how firms act with their environment. And to expand research topics. So I think a lot of the first research has really been focused on individual level issues, such as making consumers happy, which is great. But we're seeing more and more that actually cultural issues impact how firms behave and impact firm success. So expanding that range of research topics to look at cultural values, norms, and how firms fit in with that could really be productive. And then lastly, expanding the tools. As Oded mentioned, there's just a really rapidly developing world of tools, some of which can, for example, capture the relationship between entities. And so there's just a vast wealth of knowledge from computer science and other fields to incorporate into our methods. So in sum, text is the future, and we're really excited that you're interested in text as well. We welcome any questions and look forward to a discussion.
Thank you, Ashlee, Oded, and Jonah. That was terrific. So let's go ahead and take questions. And we have, again, an opportunity to enter those questions into the left-hand side of your screen. You'll see a questions and answer tab. So go ahead and answer or ask your question there, and I'll field those for our presenters. So we have a number of questions that have come in. So one from Patrick that just arrived. We're seeing more and more of our customers using images in place of text and also relying on audio for search. How do we incorporate non-text-based language that's available online?
So I mean, I could take this one, I guess, on these type of other sources which I've done some research on. So first of all, I mean, there is advantage of text, which is the richness that text provides. When it comes to things like what Jonah was talking about, understanding the underlying kind of motivations, personality, and so on, text is truly very rich and sometimes actually richer than some other sources of data. That being said, there is definitely other dimensions that are being provided by images. For example, in images, we can learn about how people interact with brands if they take a picture with a brand in it. I think an interesting one is actually voice. Voice can provide supplement information to the text itself. For example, understanding the tone, understanding not just the maybe personality of the person, but actually the state of mind at the time in which they were speaking. One of the nice things about something like a video, for example, is it may allow us to capture the entire narrative of the sequence of images and therefore understand dynamics throughout, for example, a song, a movie, a song clip, a movie. So another dimension actually adding into this discussion. What we start seeing today is some research actually that combines all of them together. So, for example, if I think about an ad that is a video ad, I can look at the audio of the ad, I can look at the video of the ad, which is a sequence of images, and then I can convert whatever text exists, whatever voice exists in this into text, and trying to analyze all of that together. And that's the holy grail of capturing unstructured data, if you will.
So, Lawrence,
just to add, maybe
ahead,
one more quick point, just building on what I think Oded and what Ashlee said earlier. To me, there are two questions about pulling insight from this type of unstructured data. One is kind of, can we extract features? And then two, can we link those features to some underlying sort of behavioral process, if you will? And I think with text, what's nice is that we both have some features we know how to extract and have gained some insight into how to link those features to underlying sort of behavioral processes. I think with voice, there are some features that we know how to extract, so things like pitch and tone. There's software out there called Pratt, which I and others have used in research. Sort of, we're using it in customer service calls, for example, to say not only was the language used, but what about how that language is used impacts satisfaction. So there's some work extracting features, some work linking those features to sort of underlying behavioral processes, but less than there is in text. And then I think when we get to images and video, I think both steps are challenging, right? There's less sort of off-the-shelf tools to extract features. We can certainly extract things like the amount of color or, in some cases, what's in an image. Is it a person or is it an animal? But that's still very far from extracting everything from that image and even further from extracting sort of underlying behavioral insight from it. And so I think, some of the things that Ashlee talked about, where we may want to do our own dictionaries or we may want to manually code some of these things, may actually be better and easier in cases when it comes to images because there's just not as much off-the-shelf stuff out there already. There's certainly some, but not as much.
Wonderful. And
one thing to add here, just on the topic of voice quickly, is there's a wealth of information, decades of research in linguistics to look to for how inflection of voice can impact certain emotions and things like this to kind of use to train our models.
Excellent. And just one quick clarification. I think the answer is yes to this, but Jacques asked about, with voice data, is it necessary to convert it all to text in order to do the analysis, or are there tools available that will literally take whatever the equivalent of voice is and allow you to do the analysis on it directly? Does it have to become text first?
I mean, there are two dimensions to it. One of them is the content of the discussion. For that, we do still convert text, voice to text. The other one is exactly the things that both Jonah and Ashlee talked about, which is the pitch, the intonation, and so on. So often we separate these two in order to gain not just the text itself, but possibly some other insights that could be obtained from the text. But for the content of the discussion, yes, generally we go from voice to text.
Wonderful. And Abhishek asks about, in terms of creating things like online profiles from text, what types of analysis are best at offering an indication of things like motivations and personality traits? How would you advise him to approach that question?
So I think that there are three ways to go about it. The simplest one would be to take one of the existing dictionaries like LIWC, and there is at this point quite a bit of research and findings that allow us to take the type of words, the type of pronouns that have been used in these texts, and convert it into things like personality, for example. And this is probably the easiest way because the dictionaries are out there. All we need is to weigh the text to extract on these. Another approach is to go and run something like topic modeling, particularly if the text itself was generated with a particular objective, for example, of motivation. If people were asked, for example, tell me about your motivations, I find that actually it works pretty well to simply look at the topics that people talked about, and that's tend to for example, map pretty nicely into motivations. The third one, which is particularly useful when the type of profile or motivation that you're looking at is very unique to the context in which you're at. We sometimes need to train our own data, meaning we would actually either predefine from our own knowledge or by having humans reading the text and identify what are the possible, say, motivations. We then take, say, 500 units of text, rate them by humans, and then we train the machine in order to identify it for the larger body of text. So something that's called supervised machine learning, where we are providing training data that often is trained by humans, unless you have maybe as Ashlee mentioned, these days sometimes we have surveys out there that allows us to do it without having humans doing it for the particular task. But I would reserve that one for situations where the type of personality profile or motivation that you're looking at are very unique to your own business.
Excellent. And so Chris is writing here about, so sometimes you don't really know, you're going through this topic discovery process using some of the tools that you mentioned. Sometimes you have say a dictionary where maybe you're looking for the use of certain words that you know are important. So how do you, as a analyst or a researcher, how do you know when you should use this kind of what you might call a bottom-up or a topic discovery method versus a top-down or dictionary approach? How do you think that decision through?
I think the place to start for that decision is how well do you know what you want to measure. So if you have a pretty good sense that we have this data set of tweets and we're interested in consumer sentiment, for example, then you know, okay, there are probably existing dictionaries and ways of measuring sentiment, and that would lead you to a more top-down approach. But, if you really don't have a sense of what you want to measure or what's important, then one of these topic modeling or bottom-up approaches gives you a place to start with seeing, okay, what's in the data. It's kind of, in some ways, a higher level of describing the data. It can give you a sense of sort of what's in there, And of course, you can then combine methods as well. So you might train a topic model and then evolve to be able to develop a dictionary that you can use on that data set and others.
Yeah, the one thing I'll add on. Oh, yeah. Go ahead, Jonah.
The one thing I was just going to say is, and I think someone else used this distinction before, but it also depends a little bit on whether you're interested more in content or in style, right? So topic modeling is really good for getting a sense of content. What are the themes that people are talking about? What are the main buckets that are talked about in reviews, the types of things that are talked about? What are the main themes in our research that are talked about in songs? It doesn't say necessarily how someone talks, the style that they're using, but it tells us a lot about the underlying themes or content that's being discussed. And so part of it depends on that, right? If I'm trying to look at, okay, is this person talking more about attribute A or attribute B, I probably care a lot about the content of what they're saying. If I want to get a sense of, what's the style of language that they're using, some other measures might be more appropriate. And so I fully agree with Ashlee. It's really about kind of what question are you trying to answer.
And I'll just add the word of warning in terms of the more bottom-up approach, unless the test that you're doing is really only predictive, meaning I'm just going to create these thousands of words and going to try and predict what's going to happen, I would advise against a fully bottom-up approach, because text is exactly the place where a paralysis by analysis happens, in the sense that there's so many possible features and so on, that if you fully start with a clean slate, you're likely to get lost. So I do encourage, even if you do go with a more of a bottom-up approach, have a priori at least some theories of what we know from linguistics, what we know from human behavior, and try to see whether you identify some of these patterns in your text, as opposed to just ask, let me see what the text can tell me, because the text is going to tell you a lot of things. Chances are most of them won't be really relevant to what you're looking for, and again, very easy to get lost in that process.
So Lawrence asks, besides English, are there any other languages that have pretty solid text mining packages out there?
That is a question I do not know the answer to. I don't know if Ashlee or Oded have any insight. I have not. I know that Luke, I believe, is available in at least one, if not two other languages. I've certainly seen linguistic or sort of computer science papers touch on other languages to some degree. I do not believe, though, that there are a lot of off-the-shelf packages that do other languages as much with other languages as they do with English.
From what I understand, too, that's true of packages like Luke, but from what I understand from other native speakers, you also have to be very careful about the translations there. So a lot of packages may say that they use other languages, but it's always best to have a native speaker kind of check those results to verify.
Well, that's
the only.
Go ahead, Oded.
I mean, the only place that I've seen that is fairly language agnostic is when we start going towards the more deep learning type tools, because these tools do not even in English, they do not actually take the word as a word, but rather they look at the level of a letter or a character, and therefore they tend to be language agnostic. That being said, they're often pretty expensive in terms of the amount of training data I need to have in order to be able to extract anything from them. So they're quite limited for purposes that are more related to things like why things are happening, more of the prediction versus understanding. They're way more on the prediction side and less on the understanding side, unfortunately.
So Nandini and Benjamin have asked about on the validation question. I think Benjamin may have asked this before we got to the slides, but both are wondering about additional acceptable or accepted ways in which we can validate our analysis using, on other types of tools like surveys. I guess this goes a little bit to combining methods, if you want to talk a little bit about, and this maybe goes a little bit to the slide that Jonah started us with around uniting the tribes, and that there may be different parts of the organization or in academia, different parts of the field that have different approaches for validation. So if you guys could just reflect a little bit on any other advice that you might have on validating, is it like Benjamin points specifically to using the human panels that Ashlee talked about, like on MTurk. Is there any other insight that you can add for the two of them?
One thing about validation to keep in mind is that there are so many kind of different things to validate. So on the one hand, it's necessary to sort of validate your the way you're measuring your language, but then there's also kind of a broader sense of validation where, and so yes, that kind of measurement validation can be done through human surveys, but then there's this more broader sense of validation where you're looking at how do our findings, the relationship between, say, our independent and dependent variable, how do they generalize more broadly? An example of that might be the one that I mentioned with Oded, where you're looking at, okay, we can do this with a certain kind of text, a certain data set. How do we take a totally different kind of data set and do the same thing so that our insights are substantively generalizable?
So a couple people have asked about materials that might be helpful in terms of next steps, whether on the analyst or researcher side within a company or for young researchers starting out. And I know you have a slide that you guys would like to take us through in terms of those additional resources. Now might be a good time.
Okay, I'm happy to take that one. So this is just a couple of resources that I think different folks on the team have been involved in one way or another. So the first is obviously the JM paper that I think Chris alluded to at the beginning, which should be available online. Ashlee also has a very nice paper sort of thinking about text analysis in the context of consumer research. In the Journal of Consumer Research, that's also had sort of a step-by-step guide through how to think about doing text analysis. We have a conference at Wharton every January that's about extracting behavioral insights from text. So there's a link to it here. I think we've all throughout the call talked a lot about LUC, linguistic inquiry and word count. That's a tool from James Pennebaker from UT Austin that's widely used. We've also been building sort of a tool to try to use some of the other approaches that are not within LUC, both other dictionaries as well as topic modeling and some other things, to the point-and-click interface. It's by no means done, but you can find the link to at least some of the beginnings of that tool here. I don't know, Oded or Ashlee, are there other tools or resources you would recommend?
I mean, I would say for most of the, again, steps I was discussing, both in terms of data cleaning and data analysis, both Python and R has a very rich set of tools actually to do these techniques, with actually several options even to choose from, maybe even too much for novice users. But again, tools that these days pretty much any graduate of a computer science program or data science program should be well versed in these tools in either or Python or R.
Wonderful.
So one tool from a novice perspective that I would recommend, I've been using a lot lately, is called WordStat. WordStat, all one word. It actually lets you, if you don't have experience coding, it actually allows you to do some of these bottom-up tasks, and it's just a point-and-click program.
Wonderful. So the article that's listed at the top, that is available on the Journal of Marketing website, as is a manager-friendly version. So all of the details that you saw in the talk today are available within that article. This webinar will be made available as well within a few days. I need to get approval from the authors in terms of potentially posting their slides. Some of you have asked about that. So we'll look for these materials up on the JM website. There will be also a commentary from one of the lead researchers at Google, Chris Chapman, that will accompany this paper when it's formally published in January. But this article is already available on the JM website. So the next, well, let me go ahead and thank our speakers for today. Really terrific to have all of you here with us. You each bring a very unique perspective, and it was, I think, very, very helpful to our audience to learn from you today about using text for marketing insights. So thank you.